Hey guys, thanks for coming back and joining us here at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back. So today we are going to talk about statistics and numbers around abortion. We talk a lot on this channel about being left-brained, being fact-based, and trying to make assessments on how the world works and what we think about it based on facts. I know it's tough on an issue like abortion, which is such an emotional issue. And I think it's one of those instances where both sides have very valid arguments and very valid feelings about how they think. And so this is not designed to take a side or to try to sway people. But I do think when an issue is as controversial and important as abortion, and so many people vote based on how a candidate feels about access to abortion, I think it's important to just get the facts around what we're talking about. It's such an important issue. Like, how many abortions are performed in the United States every year? How many are performed? Where are they performed? Who is getting abortions? What's their life story? Do they have kids? Do they have no kids? Are they married? Are they single? What's their ethnicity? How does it impact people? And so that's all we're trying to do here with this, excuse me, with this episode, is to lay the facts out. So, and we're just going to look at 1 year. The overall trend since the 1990s has been down. So the research I did, and we'll talk about where I got my information so that you can go look at it yourself. And I strongly suggest you always do that. When someone or a group or an entity presents facts, you should know where those facts came from, because it's very easy for numbers to be misconstrued. The numbers may be technically accurate, but they may be not super useful. And I can tell you that just from statistics perspective, the larger a sample size you have, the more accurate the findings you can glean from that sample size. So, democracy, people talk about democracy all the time, and we're not. The United States is not a democracy. It's not anywhere in the Constitution. In fact, it was set up to be a democratic republic specifically to avoid a democracy, because a democracy leads to mob rule. And the easiest way to describe democracy is if two wolves and one sheep vote on what's for dinner, you know what's for dinner, right? That's democracy. One more vote and you get to have your way, regardless of how negative the impact is to others. So not how things are set up in our world, but you can use numbers and statistics to sway or to paint a very different picture than the way reality actually is. So the information I got was from the Pew Research Institute, the Guttmacher Institute, and the CDC. Both the CDC and the Guttmacher Institute have tracked these for decades, tracked abortion statistics for decades. And there was a very strong affiliation at one point between the Guttmacher Institute and Planned Parenthood. And so they're intimately in that world and are able to collect that data. But the three sources I got information from, or information is aggregated from to report on abortion, are the Pew Research Institute, the Guttmacher Institute, and the CDC. So that's where this came from. So, and some of it's 2020 and some of it's from 2021, because with HIPAA and reporting privacy requirements and those kind of things, you don't, it's not as easy as one would think to get directly to this data. So with all that said, we're going to dive into some numbers now. So the total in 2020, the total number of abortions was 930,160 in the United States. And those figures are voluntarily reported by state central health agencies. Now, it's important to note that in those numbers, it was called out in the research that I read that California, Maryland, New Hampshire, and New Jersey did not report. So the reality is there's somewhere north of that number was the actual total number of abortions performed in the United States in 2020. But that's as close as we're going to get. Like we talked about, the number has been trending down. And in fact, the number of abortions in 2020 were 40% lower than the number of abortions reported in 1991. So over 30 years, the number of abortions performed in the country have pretty steadily declined pretty significantly over a 30-year period. So, and I think that's a good thing to call out. I don't think anyone is running out just randomly. Oh, boy, I really hope I can have an abortion. Like, it's a tough deal, and I think everyone needs to acknowledge that. I get the pro-life side that says, it's a life and it's human life. It's being ended. I think it's hard to argue that. Like, it leads to a human life. That's how we all started. And I don't think it's really in dispute that is, in fact, what is happening in an abortion. However, I do think there are instances where strong consideration needs to be provided to allowing those services to happen. And I don't know what the answers are. It's not, again, this is not a video to try to, or an episode to try to sway people's opinions. I think it's good that people talk through things. I would encourage people to talk through things rationally, logically, be respectful for people, because if someone chooses to have an abortion, that's a difficult decision. I don't really care who you are. That's got to be a hard thing. And so I think it's really important to be respectful when you're having these conversations with people and think about the common ground. Nobody is saying this is the first choice or a great thing. There's some folks that feel strongly that it's a woman's right to have access to this type of care. And there's some folks that feel strongly that you need to protect the unborn life because it doesn't have rights and can't it can't protect its own rights is a better way to say that. That's the argument. So, so how are these procedures performed? It's interesting that as medicine has advanced, more and more of these procedures are performed via pills versus actual medical procedures. So in 2020, the majority of abortions, 53%, were performed via pills. And so, that's an important thing to note, that in a lot of instances, the pregnancy is being caught and the decision being made very early in the pregnancy. And we'll go through some more numbers on that. But it's a much less invasive and a much less risky procedure to do it that way. Now, the FDA says that you can do medication abortions or pill assisted abortions up to 10 weeks into the pregnancy. And we'll talk about that. The vast majority of abortions are performed in the first trimester, contrary to a lot of the conversations that we hear. So how does that happen? What does that mean? A medical or a medicine abortion. There's generally two pills. From the research I found, there's generally two pills that are taken. The first is one called mifepristone, and you take that first, and it blocks the hormones that support pregnancy. Obviously, when a woman gets pregnant, her body has to support now two people, which is the argument from the pro-life side, right? Is that there's another person now involved in the equation, and that's who they're trying to protect. But mifepristone blocks the hormones that help support. So it'd be the opposite of taking neonatal vitamins that help support. The mifepristone actually blocks those hormones that the body naturally produces to support that pregnancy. And then there's the second pill that's taken called misoprostol, which causes the uterus to empty. So it, in fact, starts the menstruation cycle and flushes out the uterus. So that's how that works. And then the medical procedures, there's a couple different medical procedures, but it's usually some type of procedure where the cells and or the fetus are removed from the wall and vacuumed out. And so, that's tough. That's a tough thing to go through. And as a mom, I would think that'd be very difficult to make that decision and have to live with that decision. So certainly not my place to judge. Again, we're trying to lay out facts so everyone kind of clearly understands what it is that we're talking about here. So in 2020, there were just over 1,600 facilities providing abortions. There were 807 clinics, 530 hospitals, and 266 physicians' offices that offered abortion services. Now, with that said, the vast majority of procedures, whether they be medicine related or medical intervention related, are performed at clinics. So clinics were half of all the facilities, 807 of 1,603, but they provided 96% of those services in 2020. Hospitals were 33% of the facilities, but they only provided 3% of those services in 2020. And then physicians' offices, even though there were 266 of them, they provided 1% of those services. So in 2020. Vast majority of these procedures are happening at the 800 or so clinics that exist across the country. So, and if there's, call it 50 states, that averages out to around 80 clinics per state. I know the distribution is not equal, but it averages out to about 80 clinics or 80 facilities per state. So, what were the demographics? Now we're going to jump to 2021 because I couldn't find a lot of good demographics for 2020, but the numbers in 2021 were very similar on what had been reported. So roughly the same number of abortions. And so we're going to use these just as context for how things worked in 2021. So what was the age of the women that had abortions in 2021? 57% of those abortions were women in their 20s. 31% were women in their 30s. 4% were women from ages 40 to 44. And then 8% were women aged 13 to 19. So, there's a lot of arguments around abortion being necessary for young girls who were not ready to become parents, and get it. And there is, 8% of those procedures in 2021 fell into that category. However, the vast majority, 92%, are women in their 20s and above. So, you're old enough to vote, you're old enough to drink, you're old enough to drive a car, you can sign contracts, make legal agreements. You're old enough to understand the consequences of your actions, as are the men that are involved in these transactions as well. So it's just as important for men to take responsibility for preventing unwanted pregnancy. I would argue more important. I have 3 sons, and I've told them, I don't care what any girl says to you, it is your responsibility to practice safe sex. I don't care if she says she's on shots, has an IUD, is infertile, is on the pill. I don't care. Throw a rubber on. It's your responsibility as a man to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's the way I think about it. But as it relates to abortion, this is not, the vast majority of instances are not young girls who made a mistake with their first boyfriend or on a prom night or things like that. The vast majority are adult women who are terminating unwanted pregnancies. So 87% of the women who had abortions were unmarried, and 13% were married. So it's much more common for an unmarried woman to have an abortion than a married woman to have an abortion. Now, there weren't any statistics that said of that 87%, how many were in committed relationships, how many, had whatever, a one-night stand or an uncommitted relationship, a fling, whatever you want to call it, and wound up pregnant. So there were no statistics behind that, but the vast majority of women that are having abortions are not married. Of the abortions, 42% of them were performed on Black women, 30% were performed on white women, 22% were performed on Hispanic women, and 6% were performed on some other ethnicity, whatever, Asian or Native American, whatever the case may be. So 42% Black, 30% white, 22% Hispanic, and 6% some other race. Now, okay, fine, that's the total number, but you really want to try to normalize those numbers to understand within a particular population what is the rate of abortion. So in the overall general population, it's about 14.4 abortions per thousand child rearing aged women. So it's about 14.4. It's important, right? So that's why the number stops at 44. Generally, women stop being able to reproduce. Some go through menopause, some don't, but it's much less common for a woman above 44 to be pregnant. So the numbers that I read limited this to aged 13 to 44, which is generally when menstruation starts and stops speaking very broadly. There's lots of people who fall outside of that. I get it, but you've got to make some type of guardrails to kind of put statistics together. So that's what we're doing here. So among blacks, there's 28.6 abortions per thousand child rearing aged women. Hispanics, it's 12.3 abortions per thousand child rearing aged women. With white women, it's 6.4% under 6.4% per thousand child rearing aged women, and then 9.2 per thousand women of other ethnicities of childbearing age. So you can see that it's a disproportionate impact on the black community, anything that relates to abortion. So yeah, those are the numbers. And again, those are for 2021 because that was the information that was available. So of the women that have abortions, how many of them are having multiple abortions? It's another argument that you hear, largely from the pro-life. There's some abortion punch card that women have, and they can just go get as many abortions as they want, and it's a great thing. I don't think anyone thinks it's a great thing, but what are the numbers? How many women are having abortions for the first time, and how many have had previous abortions when they go and have another one? So in 2021, 57% of those abortions were first-time abortions. So these were women that had never had an abortion before, and they had one. 24%, this was the second abortion that they had. So they had one previously, and they were back to have another one. 11% was the third time. So they had two previous abortions and were having a third done. And then 8%, it was their fourth or more abortion. So that was a surprising number to me. I didn't expect that number to be so high. So 57% were first-time abortions, which means 43% had already had at least one abortion when they went back to get another abortion. So that number was surprising to me. I didn't expect that number to be that high. That's just my own personal surprise. I don't know that it's founded in anything, but I was surprised at how high that number was. And then how many women that had abortions already had kids or had a previous birth. And I think what they were trying to drive at there was they'd had a birth and given it up for adoption. They had a birth and had complications and lost the child, whatever the case may be. But how many had gone through the live birth process and then chosen to have an abortion? So 39% in 2021, 39% of the women that had abortions had no previous live births. They'd never given birth, and they were there to have an abortion. 24% had one previous live birth. 20% had two previous live births. 10% had three previous live births. And 7% had four or more previous live births. Now, that really surprised me as well, because 39% had no live birth, which meant 61%, the majority of women that are having abortions, have had a live birth before. And so I think about my three kids and the relationship my wife has with them. I have a good relationship with them too, but it's a very different relationship when you're the one that carries and births the child, for sure. 61% of the abortions performed in 2021 were done on women that had at least one live birth previous to their abortion. So yeah, that was a surprising number to me. I don't know if I'm right to be surprised or not. But those are the numbers. And so, again, I'm just trying to provide context and center everybody's mind around what is it we're actually talking about here. So when you think about a country of 335 million people, call it, and we're talking about just under 1 million people undergoing this procedure every week, this is like 0.3% of the population. That's driving a huge issue that thinks that we talk about on how we manage our country. And it's an important issue to a lot of people, but it really impacts a very small percentage of the population. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we're talking through these things. And then when in the pregnancy do these abortions occur? Because one of the arguments you hear largely from the pro-life side is, they want to have abortions up to and even at birth. Look, there could be instances where that is true, but the numbers really don't support that in any way. So 93% of abortions occurred in the first trimester. So that's first 13 weeks. That's very early on in the pregnancy, and it's very early on in the cycle. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then 6% occurred between 14 and 20 weeks. So before you get to halfway, which is 26, well, no, sorry, it's not 26. It's essentially 19, 20 weeks. So when you get to halfway, 99% of the procedures that occurred before you get to that point. And then there's 1% that occurred at 21 weeks or more. So there is not even close to a bunch of abortions being performed on babies that have heartbeats and could exist outside the womb, even with really great neonatal care or those types of things. So the procedures that are happening largely are being done very early on in the pregnancy. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're having these conversations or when we're talking about this subject. Now, I really wanted to try to find and report on the number of procedures that were undertaken because there was a pregnancy that resulted from rape or incest or the health of the mother. But those numbers were very hard to get to, and they were so fuzzy that it really was difficult to draw any conclusions. The one thing I will say is that the health of the mother seemed to be, in everything I read, seemed to be less than 2% of total abortions, whether it was a state reporting that, whether it was for a total year reporting that, whether it was an estimate, but that seemed to be less than 2%. So it's not very common for a woman to have an abortion because the doctor and or the medical team is concerned about their health should they carry the pregnancy to term. And then rape and incest were actually much, much lower. So both of those and everything I could find were under 0.5%. So of all the abortions performed, those that were performed because there was a pregnancy that was the result of a rape or of incest were less than 0.5% of the total abortions performed. So I did find that interesting. I don't really have any solid numbers to quote there, but everything I looked at and everything I read, and remember, Pew Institute, Guttmacher Institute, and the CDC is where all this information is coming from. So pretty reputable organizations that track and report these numbers. So yeah. So that's the situation. I think the one other thing I would say is I've heard a lot of people talk about abortion being outlawed on this Dobbs decision that happened a year or so ago. And it's just important to understand that's not what happened. There was no outlaw of abortion. It was removed. The constitutional right to an abortion was removed. I would say that it's not the first time, not even close to the first time, that the Supreme Court has reversed itself on a previous decision. There's some pretty famous ones that the court really got wrong that were reversed later. And so, like the most egregious one, in my opinion, was Plessy v. Ferguson, which I think was the late 1890s, if I remember right. It might have been early 1900s. But Plessy v. Ferguson essentially established separate but equal. So it constitutionalized segregation. It constitutionalized Jim Crow, which clearly was wrong. And then that was reversed and corrected with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So just because there's a previous ruling, and I get it, I got lots of friends that are attorneys. I'm not an attorney. I didn't stay at Holiday Inn Express last night, but I'm also not an idiot. And I know that the courts work off of precedent, and we as a society work off of precedent because if you know how laws have been interpreted previously, it gives you a guide on how they're going to be interpreted in the future. And you can make decisions on that, whether they're personal decisions, business decisions, family decisions, all of those things. But I don't think simply because precedent has been established, when the precedent is clearly wrong, as it was in Plessy v. Ferguson, that it shouldn't be reversed when the court has the opportunity to do so. I would argue like the Kelo decision where they took the woman's house in Connecticut and gave it to a developer who to this date has not developed that site. I keep waiting for that one to be reversed as well because I think the Supreme Court got that wrong. So the whole point of that is the fact that the Dobbs decision was done the way it was, I don't think should be surprising. Almost any constitutional scholar will say that the original Roe v. Wade was founded on very dubious legal terms and was always at risk because it was a very big stretch to essentially say that your right to privacy includes the right to an abortion, which was essentially the way that Roe v. Wade was decided. So, anyhow, there it is, guys. There's all the statistics that I found on abortion. Again, I'm a big fan of using fact based decisions and thinking about things logically and using numbers and statistics to support those arguments. So, I guess my big takeaways are there's a much higher number of women that already have kids having abortions. That surprised me. There is a lot of women that are having multiple abortions. That surprised me also. And it did not surprise me that the vast majority of these procedures are performed very early in the pregnancy. So while it's worth having the conversation around abortions performed on much more developed human fetuses, it just doesn't happen very often. It's just really not a huge issue. And I get it. One life is one life. Not arguing that. I'm just saying it is not even near the majority. That's 1%. So less than 1%, right? So, yeah. And then secondly, I would say that the arguments around rape for carve outs for rape, incest, and the health of the mother. Look, I think those are good conversations to have, but that's not even close to why the vast majority of abortions are being performed. So while it's a good talking point, if that's your thing, it's not the reality of what's going on in our country or on these procedures. So anyhow, hope you found it useful, guys. It's one of those things that kind of gets kicked around a lot, but I don't know a lot of people that do a deep dive into the numbers that go behind that. And I hope you found it helpful. I hope you find it useful and you can incorporate that into your conversations with other people. I found it interesting, and I think it's a good way to think about it and look at things. And I'm going to keep it in front of my mind if and when I have conversations with folks on this topic. So, again, guys, thanks for coming back and joining us here. Don't forget to go to our website, saltygingertalk.com. We have links to all of our social media and all of our content on our website. All of our podcasts are available on our website. You can sign up to receive our newsletter on our website. So thanks again for coming back and joining us, guys. Have a great week, and we will see you soon.